The Norman Conquest of 1066 did not just change kings, it changed language, literature, imagination, and the very soul of England. Welcome to English Literaria. Today, we embark on an intellectual journey through a period of profound philological evolution. We are exploring the vital span of nearly 3 centuries where the very fabric of English identity was unraveled and rewoven into the vibrant tapestry we recognize today. To appreciate the sophisticated heights of Chaucer's verse, we must first descend into the Valley of the Conquest. Think of this era not as a dark age, but a strategic bridge, a preparation age. On one side, we have the stark Germanic roots of Beowulf, heroic, fatalistic, and alliterative. On the other, we find the rhymed, courtly, and continental world of the High Middle Ages. Between them lies a story of forced linguistic synthesis, a great silence, and an eventual, glorious reemergence of the English voice. Let us begin our masterclass. On this slide, we observe the visual progression of this remarkable transformation. Look first at the dragon-headed Viking ship of the 9th century, the embodiment of raw, predatory energy. Next, we see the settled Norman town of the 10th century, where they adopted the French language and Christianity. Finally, look upon the fortified stone castles of 1066, the symbols of civilized conquerors and centralized power. This brings us to the event, the absolute pivot point of our study, the Battle of Hastings in 1066. Here, William, Duke of Normandy, defeated Harold, the last Saxon king. This ended Anglo-Saxon rule and birthed the Anglo-Norman identity, a culture born of the forced fusion between the Germanic Anglo-Saxon majority and the French-speaking Norman minority. If you are to carry one date into your examinations, let it be 1066. It is the absolute meridian between our literary past and future. Literature before this is Old English, defined by Germanic alliteration. Literature after this begins the transition to Middle English, characterized by French influence and the introduction of rhyme. This political earthquake necessitated a new structure for the nation, moving us away from the tribal battlefield and towards the centralized state. On this slide, let us contemplate the 3 grand pillars supporting the edifice of modern English literature. First, Roman civilization. As the scholar William J. Long elegantly noted, the Normans were the first to bring the culture and the practical ideals of Roman civilization home to the English people. They reconnected a Saxon island long buried in isolation to the broader intellectual life of the continent. Second, centralized government, which replaced loose tribalism with a strong, unified national consciousness. Third, a new language. French became the tongue of the upper crust, eventually enriching our lexical treasury with nuance, elegance, and beauty. When you are evaluated on the political impact of the conquest on literature, you must explicitly cite this shift from tribalism to centralized nationality as the catalyst for a unified literary voice. With power now concentrated in the hands of the Norman minority, a strict linguistic hierarchy began to dictate the boundaries of medieval discourse. On this slide, we see the fusion process tree illustrating the linguistic stratification of the age. At the highest branches, in the light of scholarship, is Latin, the language of the clergy, used for the church and history. Beneath it is French, Norman, the language of the court, the nobility, fashion, and romance. At the roots, we find English, Saxon, the survival language of the commoners, earthy, strong, and persistent. We must be precise with our phonology. A Romance language is a tongue derived from Vulgar Latin, the speech of the Roman soldiers. This includes French, Italian, and Spanish. Do not confuse this linguistic term with the literary genre of Romance. During this great silence, come 1066 to 1200, English was being refined in the shadows. When it re-emerged, it had been transformed into Middle English. Master this status hierarchy. English was for common speech, French for polite literature, and Latin for serious scholarship. This hierarchy did more than change how people spoke, it fundamentally altered the nature of the stories they were willing to preserve. On this slide, the contrast is a starring. On the left, the old way. A somber Saxon warrior stands alone by a gray, churning sea. This is the world of Beowulf, focused on the mystery of life and the philosophy that life is a struggle against doom. On the right, the new way. Bright, colorful Norman knights engage in the spectacle of battle under a golden sun. This is the world of the Chanson du Roland, focused on entertainment and variety. As the medieval saying goes, if the truth isn't exciting, add a giant. The Norman philosophy viewed life as a tumultuous holiday of knightly adventure. You must distinguish between these two fundamental genres. Beowulf is a heroic epic, the communal defense of the tribe, while Roland is a metrical romance, focused on individual knightly errantry and the code of chivalry. To see how these colorful new ideals were captured, we must examine the physical and expensive medium of the age. On this slide, we see an illuminated manuscript, a library in a book. A single volume, such as the Auchinleck MS, might contain a bewildering content variety, the lives of saints nestled next to bawdy jokes, or political satire sitting beside the legends of King Arthur. Because there was no printing press and a very restricted reading audience of clergy and aristocracy, the written word catered to aristocratic tastes, French romance, rather than the common tastes of the English folk. Understand that the lack of a broad reading public is why popular literature, such as ballads, remained an oral tradition, while high literature, like the Romance, was carefully committed to vellum. Yet, one of the most influential written acts of the 12th century was a magnificent fabrication that changed history. On this slide, we see the portrait of Geoffrey and a flowchart of his massive influence. Though he wrote in Latin, his work introduced the Arthurian legend to the world, providing the raw material for future giants, Malory's Morte d'Arthur, Shakespeare's King Lear and Cymbeline, and Tennyson's Idylls of the King. Geoffrey is the primary source for the Arthurian cycle in European literature. He is the man who single-handedly turned Arthur from a minor regional Celtic chieftain into a world-renowned king. But how did these Celtic legends become the national stories of the very people who had conquered the Celts? On this slide, the map illustrates the migration of these legends. Originating in Wales and Cornwall, they were carried to Brittany by fleeing Celts. There they were polished and refined by Norman poets such as Gaimar, c. 1150, and Wace, c. 1155, who in his Roman de Brut famously added the Round Table. The French Normans colonized these myths, turning a former enemy into a courtly ideal. Genealogy of romance. Remember this sequence for your notes. The Arthurian legend is Celtic in origin, French in literary form, and eventually English in adoption. The cycle was completed when the English tongue finally reclaimed these stories for its own. On this slide, we see a linguistic breakdown of Layamon's manuscript through a magnifying glass. Look at the vocabulary. It is a resiliently stubborn, almost pure Anglo-Saxon, containing only about 50 French words in 30,000 lines. Yet the style is transitional. It maintains Old English alliteration, but introduces the new French rhyme. Layamon provides the first appearance in English poetry of Arthur's death and his mystical journey to Avalon to be healed by elf queens. Remember, Brut is the bridge. It connects the Old English alliterative past with the incoming French rhyming future. This bridge led directly into the dominant genre of the Middle Ages. On this slide, the stained glass image of a knight captures the spirit of the age. The ingredients of romance were threefold: themes, love, chivalry, and religion, a tone that was childish and credulous, willing to suspend disbelief for giants and wizards, and a form that fused French meter, syllable counting, with Saxon rhythm, stress counting. Central to this was chivalry, the medieval code of conduct, bravery in war, loyalty to the king, and service to God and women. Genre shift. We are witnessing the death of the epic, national defense, and the birth of the romance, individual knight-errantry. As these romances proliferated, scholars organized them into 4 distinct matters. On this slide, we see 4 heraldic shields representing these categories. 1. The matter of France, Charlemagne and his peers, example, the Song of Roland. 2. The matter of Rome, tales from antiquity, Alexander the Great, Troy, retold as medieval knights. 3. The matter of Britain, King Arthur and the Round Table. And 4. The matter of England, stories of native English heroes like Guy of Warwick. Classification. Students, take note. A classic trap question in examinations is, to which matter does King Horn belong? Despite its title, it belongs to the Matter of England. While many of these were formulaic, one work stands as the best in class. On this slide, we see the iconic, vivid green illustration of the Green Knight, an arresting contrast of the verdant, severed head against the courtly backdrop. The plot is a masterpiece of tension. A giant green knight challenges Arthur's court to a beheading game. Gawain accepts and beheads the giant, only for the knight to pick up his head and demand a rematch in 1 year. The symbols are profound. The Green Knight represents the untamed world of nature and magic, and the green girdle represents human frailty. Crucially, Gawain hides the girdle to save his life, failing the test of perfect chivalry. The structure uses the complex bob and wheel stanza, a long alliterative section followed by a short rhyming conclusion. The lesson: in this poem, true honor involves the humility of admitting one's faults. But literature was not only found in the courts, it was kept alive in the cloisters. After 1066, the English voice went underground, while French became the language of the court. But by the late 13th century, the alliterative revival erupted, proving the language had survived its winter. At the summit stands the Pearl Poet, an anonymous master who fused the moral seriousness of the Saxon soul with French courtly grace. Unlike the pioneer Layamon, the Pearl Poet was a refined architect. He navigated a trilingual England, English roots for strength, a French trunk for fashion, and Latin leaves for intellect. His anonymity elevates him, allowing his visions to speak for a new national consciousness. The poet's work is grounded in Saxon moral gravity, the fatalistic weird of the mead hall. In Sir Gawain and the Green Queen, the green girdle represents human frailty, When Gawain hides it to save his life, he confronts the heavy reality that even heroes are mortal and flawed. If the Saxon influence is the gray salt spray of reality, the French influence is the gold of vision. The poet utilizes the metrical romance, replacing the tribal defense of the heroic epic with the individual knight's quest. He understood that if truth isn't exciting, you add a giant to provide spiritual escapism. This duality is mirrored in the bob and wheel stanza. It bridges the ancient Germanic heartbeat of alliteration with the elegant rhymes of the continent. This structure proved that Middle English was a rich tradition capable of expressing the most nuanced human emotions. The Anglo-Norman period was not a dark age, but a preparation age. The Pearl poet was its harvest, creating the literary soil for Geoffrey Chaucer. His work remains a testament to the beauty that emerges when two worlds collide, the triumphant end of a 300-year winter. On this slide, we see three vital manuscripts that kept the English heart beating. Ancren Riwle, c. 1225, or the Rule of Anchoresses, is the finest example of early English prose, vivid, practical, and tender. We also have the Ormulum, c. 1200, which is of immense philological value for its study of medieval spelling and pronunciation. Finally, Corsair Mundi, c. 1320, is an encyclopedic history in verse, organizing all of time into a Christian framework. Ancren Riwle is the key text here. It kept English prose alive while the literary world was enchanted by French verse. Finally, we must hear the voice of those who lived outside the castle and the church. On this slide, we see the silhouette of a yeoman archer in the greenwood. This is the Robin Hood cycle. Here, the conflict is democratic: Saxons versus Normans, the poor versus sheriffs, and the common man against unjust game laws. Note the democratic contrast. Romance, aristocratic, written, complex, housed in the castle. Ballad, democratic, oral, simple, born in the greenwood. The hero is not a knight, but a yeoman, loyal to the king, but an enemy to the corrupt clergy and local law. This brings us to our final synthesis. On this slide, a bridge connects a medieval castle to the figure of Geoffrey Chaucer. This 300-year fusion resulted in 1. Language, Saxon grammar plus French vocabulary equals Middle English. 2. Politics, tribalism plus feudalism equals English nationality. 3. Literature, Saxon gloom plus Norman romance equals a rich, varied tradition. Geoffrey Chaucer was not a freak occurrence. He was the harvest of this long season of preparation. The environment created by this 300-year synthesis made his genius possible. In summary, this preparation age bridges the gap between the ancient Germanic past and our modern world. It provided the linguistic tools and the narrative soul that would define English literature for centuries to come. If this lecture has sparked further curiosity about our literary ancestors, I invite you to subscribe for our next session on the genius of Chaucer. Please share your reflections or scholarly doubts in our colloquium in the comments section below. I look forward to our discussion.